So, in the past you may have thought to yourself and wondered, this is metal. That's not a woodwind. Actually, it is. Here's why. So fundamentally, there are three reasons why a flute should be considered a woodwind and not something else. The first reason has to do with how the instrument is producing sound. So with woodwinds, you're generally looking at vibrating the air inside the instrument, so the instrument is kind of doing the legwork, some part of it, whether it be, a reed or a blown edge. And brass instruments tend to have the sound, or always have the sound coming from yourself, lips buzzing to produce sound that is amplified and directed by the instrument. So with reeded instruments, you're blowing across an edge, and in that case the reed, that vibrates, but that's not actually producing the sound. What's producing the sound is you're opening and closing that space a bunch of times in a row, which creates an oscillating air column, which then vibrates through the inside of the instrument. The same property happens on a flute. You're blowing across a blown edge, but it's just on the lip plate instead of a reed. It's serving the same function, even though it's not opening and closing per se. It is vibrating throughout the instrument in that manner. Reason number two, you should factor in how the instrument is changing pitch in the first place. So, as you can see, woodwinds tend to have complicated looking systems of keys, and like 16 to 25 different key openings, that's just a random estimation, of places where you're using kind of all of your fingers to do this. And on brass instruments, you're generally using valves. And of course there are different types of like rotary valves or piston valves to get the job done, but you're lengthening the instrument by rerouting where the air is going, rather than just closing sections of a tube fundamentally like you would be on a woodwind. And obviously there are exceptions to this, like the trombone doesn't use valves, unless you're talking about a valve trombone, that's a whole different thing. And there are some exceptions, like keyed trumpets and ophicleides that are brass instruments with keys, but those are things that have been tried and generally considered failures as instruments that aren't used anymore. And that's why you can consider the different key or valve mechanisms on an instrument, determine how to classify it. Because like on a woodwind, you're going to be opening and closing holes along a tube, whereas on a brass instrument, you're generally going to be lengthening it in some manner, whether that be valves or a slide in some cases. That's something to consider when you're talking about, is this a woodwind? So the third thing to consider is where the sound is coming out. So on a woodwind instrument, like on this bass flute, if I finger an A here, the sound is going to come out of the next open hole, and it's not like, blasting out in one direction. There's a pad on top of it, so it's kind of dispersing out that way, and that location is going to change depending on what note I'm playing, which makes them a little bit harder to mic than some other instruments. Brass instruments are pointed in one direction. All the sound comes out in one place every time, whether that be out in front of you like a trumpet or a trombone, or up above you, or down back here like a horn. It's going to be a pretty big difference depending on, and that's a big tell. So at this point you might be thinking, does the material matter at all? Because if it's not made of wood, but you can call it a woodwind, is there any time I should factor in what it's made out of? And that definitely used to be the case. So the terms woodwind and brass wind were coined based on the materials that were available at the time. And that was a time where brass instruments were pretty much only made of brass, and woodwinds were made out of wood. So you're dealing with primarily wood flutes, you're dealing with wood clarinets, and the first saxophone patents were actually for wooden instruments, although that very quickly changed. Also bassoon, oboe, whatever. And going back further than that, you have ancient flutes that used, ivory and bone or bamboo, or different kinds of materials even further. But as manufacturers started to get access to a wealth of materials, that quickly changed. Like clarinets moved into a cheaper price point by using plastic in some cases, and you started being able to deal with all of these cool alloys and stuff. Like this bass flute is like a nickel silver alloy. This flute is platinum that's plated over silver. And, you know, going even further forward, you have higher tech materials like composite, which is wood fibers bonded by plastic and other complex compounds. So that has really changed over time. And the names of the families aren't going to change to classify with that. Those are pretty set. So we've gotten to a point where material doesn't really matter. And like with brass instruments, they're still mostly made out of brass, but you do sometimes see brass instruments made out of different things, like silver trumpets and other stuff. And there's still many cultures that use flutes dating back thousands of years, like bowoos and dizzies that use wood always. Technically, I should clarify, flutes with like ivory head joints get bought and sold all the time, but I'm really not sure about the legality of buying and selling ivory, so maybe stay away from that. Also, they're terrible. They crack all the time. And there you have it. From sound production and key mechanisms to a little bit of history and context, I hope you understand now why this is a woodwind and this is disgusting. Just kidding. This is a trumpet. That's not a real brass instrument. Why this is a brass instrument. And this is a woodwind. These things aren't made of wood. Why are they woodwinds? Question answered, maybe.
And hopefully, after all this, you appreciate flutes a little bit more than he does.
No! So, there are 3 reasons why the flute is a woodwind that I'm going to go into. That doesn't make any sense though. Why would I say that?